Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. I know all of you, so I guess I don't have to introduce myself, but Sarah, BDCC. We are here with David Kim tonight. He is co-founder of IDA as well as one of their current faculty members, and he's been partnering with us through this 4-month process with the town of Rockingham. And tonight he's going to be talking about the Dirty Dozen, and I'll let him, obviously go into detail on that. Do you have anything to say or add? Sorry.
I guess I would just like to thank our sponsors before we start. The BDCC Southern Vermont Economy Project, Vermont Community Foundation, Vermont Council on Rural Development, Vermont Natural Resources Council Smart Growth Program, the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and the Preservation Trust of Vermont. So we have a really robust lecture and hands-on training program, technical assistance program, and it is only possible because of this broad base of support. So we really appreciate that.
And it looks like Alex just joined us. Alex, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I just left another meeting. So
all good. You entered literally at the time that I was gonna stick you in to say something if you wanted to.
Yeah, great. Just nice to meet everyone. I'm just jumping in for the place of Jim Kuman tonight. I'm Alexandra Nielsen. I am the Training and Operations Manager with IncDev. So I am here to kind of get us kicked off. And David, I just wanted to make sure you are good to go on IncDev's end. So it's nice to meet everyone, and thank you for joining tonight.
Thanks, Alex.
Great.
All right, take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Alex and Sarah. Before I begin, I wanted to just get a sense of, well, are any of you involved in administering zoning rules, or no? Any of you experienced at reading zoning rules and trying to apply them?
John Bennett, raise your hand.
Okay, I'm sure some of this will hit a nerve in your experience. So I will go and share my screen. Let's see. Can everybody see that?
Okay. Yep, looks good.
Yep.
Dirty Dozen. So we're going to talk about administrative contamination, things that get in the way of actually incremental development, things that the rules that we have on our books, and typically when we talk about these rules that have been actually getting in the way of actually replicating the same patterns of what most of the villages or most of the places that we actually love or that we actually enjoy. And it's hard to actually, these are the rules that then inhibit and many times prevent these things from actually happening. It makes it more difficult for us to replicate the the buildings that we see on our main streets, the small 2-family, 3-family, 4-family house buildings, apartments that many of us probably have lived in. Why they're not being built, and so as you can see, this first slide represents kind of what we normally see in existing places, and in many of our let me move this window over. In existing places in many of our pre-war to World War II villages, towns, and cities, they're usually, if you can just get a sense of them, they're usually dense at the center, and they sort of taper out towards the edges, where the edges are made up of farm farmland or become natural edges, rather than endless sprawl or strip malls. They tend to be these many of the existing places, especially in New England and in the Northeast, they tend to be walkable, or they used to be, and they used to have a diversity of building types, both commercially as well as residentially, and they're typically finer grained, meaning they're in small increments. The basic patterns that we're trying to replicate. So what are the advantages of this type of pattern is that it enables because of the diversity of spaces and type of living arrangements, they enable local entrepreneurs to build their businesses much more easily, and it allows for a full range of people to live in these places. So it's, someone who grows up or someone who's younger can live in a studio apartment or a 1-bedroom apartment, and then maybe move to a more compact house or a larger house, and then eventually when their kids move out, they can move back into a smaller apartment. So so why does development often look like that? A building that's in the center of a property and has parking lots surrounding it, and usually there's no front, because it's a building in the round.
I used to work in that building.
Unfortunately, that's been many of our experiences. Yeah.
Was that Pioneer Valley?
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to work in that building too, and it looks.
Yeah,
exactly like
I made popcorn in that building.
So this is about identifying the hurdles, and these are not specifically tailored to Bellows Falls or the town of Rockingham, but there are rules that we encounter, hurdles that we encounter, kind of that is common barriers that we've encountered all throughout our practice. So a few questions to keep in mind as we kind of examine these rules or these hurdles is that, what was the original purpose of these rules? Thinking about, and oftentimes we will never find out why they did what they did. And how do these rules affect, the cost? Because they have real impact and therefore affordability. And do these rules actually exclude certain demographic? And are they getting the results we want in terms of, I think oftentimes many of our communities, all of them, we've updated our comprehensive plan. At least in my village, we've updated our comprehensive plan and recently, and it has a lot of great visioning statements, but the zoning rules make them impossible to realize. And so we're having to pass an overlay zone that everybody's disagrees on as well, in terms of what it might result in. So the first of our hurdles is the suburban lot standards. They make everything wrong size, and as many of you know, or those of you who've looked at zoning rules, you look at many of our existing places are made up of smaller lots, usually 25 to 30 or 40 feet wide, and or whatever increments they might be in. And but the rules often say, I think in your case in Bellows Falls, it says 7,000 square foot lot, 70-foot wide frontage. They often, like in my case, in our neighborhood, my neighborhood, where I live, we live in a 2-family in a neighborhood of single families, but it says single family, but the about 30% of all the buildings here are 2 families, and about 90% of all parcels are what we call existing non-conforming, because they don't meet the lot size requirements that have been overlaid in the zoning rules that were first implemented and probably subsequently revised. I'm finding that in the Northeast that most of our rules were adopted in the late 60s and early 70s. And it makes replicating the existing patterns very difficult. Once you have a smaller lot, the setbacks also reduce the amount of area that you could build on. And so therefore, if you were to actually look at how you can do this, you would end up getting a little sliver of a building on a small parcel. So, and these standards also have financial impact. Aside from not being able to make the logical thing happen, because what ends up happening is if there's an empty lot or a building becomes, I think in many cases they become derelict or empty and it gets bulldozed or it has to be cleared, then someone who tries to go and build something there cannot build anything without a lot of variances or a lot of changes. So you end up, if you really wanted to build something there, you end up having to buy an additional lot, but you can only build the same or the similar type of building that's on the adjacent lot. So you can see that the value per acre, if you aggregate 2 lots, you're building one building on 2 lots, and the assessment is higher. The value per acre, as I think Jim talked about it in his previous lecture. As well as the cost goes up as well for the cost of, because the land, now you're having to buy 2 parcels and building on the same parcel, building one house on the 2 parcels, so the costs go up. Next one is parking requirements. They have, they affect, they have many consequences, and unfortunately, they drive the costs up by requiring more land, and when the costs go up for building something, the affordability goes up. Goes out the window. Values go down because you can build more. You can build, per area of land. You can build. You can end up being able to build only smaller buildings, and the streets aren't attractive because the buildings never come to the street fronts. They never, and because they're also designed in the round, there is no front, and so they get the street. It degrades the street life as well as, and we talk about the buildings being taller, and then it also degrades the walkability because now you're having to experience parking lots, empty spaces, which affects anything where you have to do walking, biking, and transit. And then it also, when you have a lot of impervious surfaces, it creates, it requires expensive stormwater management. Now, so what are some of the things that we can do to make those modifications? Make modifications to these parking requirements, require less parking, count the parking that's on the street, as well as reduce the number of parking spaces, because oftentimes parking requirements are very much overparked, meaning there are too many parking spaces required for the actual use. And if you go and look at the empirical evidence of the way people utilize parking, you'll find that there's a lot more spaces than needed. Long-term goal is require no parking minimums, or don't require parking at all, meaning allow the market to actually regulate the parking. Simply and get to a point where you as a community learn how to manage the parking resource, because parking, it's free parking is actually a drain on resources, and it also subsidizes those who can have a car versus the ones who do not have one or who can't have one. The ones who can least afford it are the ones that pay the highest costs.
David, if people have questions, do you want them
Sure.
to just unmute themselves and ask, or wait till the end?
Sure, go ahead and feel free to ask questions.
Okay, great.
I can't see the chat.
No, people can just unmute themselves and ask if they have a question.
Okay, here it is. This is an example of how you can, if you require 20 parking spaces, how can you arrange them? And the obvious, the thing that most people do, the common way of accommodating 20 parking spaces is put it out front like that. And in this example, instead of having one giant building, you get a multiple number of buildings with the parking on the back, so that it actually creates street life. Stormwater management is another crucial aspect of the way that inhibits incremental development. As I mentioned, the more impervious surface you have, often required by parking, requires active management of stormwater, and also the requirement to regulate or to mitigate stormwater on individual parcels can be a real issue as well, especially in the smaller lots. The better to approach it in a district-wide stormwater management rather than on individual lots, because oftentimes, if you look at the typical Main Street building, 25 foot wide by maybe 40 to 60 feet deep, usually takes up 60 to 80% of the parcel, on a 60 or 80% of the footprint of the parcel. And so there's no room for stormwater management. And if you, on top of that, if you require them to dig up their land and then put in active stormwater management, then that will make it impossible or unaffordable for them to do anything with. So require less parking can be one way to do it. Plant more street trees and regulate the stormwater management by building footprint, non-occupancy, or leading to more natural ways, and also dealing with it as a district area rather than just individual parcels. Single family zoning, I think Jim talked about this before as well. In single family zones, in terms of financing wise, well, a house is a big house. Let's say an average house of, I think in America, an average home is about 2,500 square foot. And you could create in the same envelope, you could have two 1,250 square foot households, or you could even have a four unit household, 4 unit building that's made up of 650 square foot or 675 square foot units that are either studio or 1-bedroom units. FHA, as Jim mentioned, I think in his previous lecture, says that they regard the financing, the 30-year mortgage is from 1 to 4 family house. They might have, anything from 2 to 4 family might have a slightly stiffer, slightly higher requirement, or may require a slightly higher a rate, but it's just like a house, and we should build, that we should not inhibit that from then happening in the same neighborhood as single family. It's because if you look at most of the typically historical neighborhoods, you'll find all of these types, all kind of survive, all right next to each other. And the diversity of housing types that I was talking about, the diversity of housing household arrangements, allows for people to live there throughout their lifetime, so that they can find the right type of household, the right type of unit for their way of living at the moment in time. Accessory dwelling units. There are lots of rules. I think if you're, what we found was that even though many jurisdictions say they allow accessory dwelling units, they really make it almost next to impossible to actually for anyone to build, and for anyone to build, for anyone to create any of these things, because they will there will be they're treated like the impact fees are treated like a regular single family or a large home, and they require parking, and so there are lots of restrictions on them. But if it's they're the easiest way to insert affordable or actually attainable units, housing into neighborhoods, existing neighborhoods, without even impacting them very much at all. Now, I know that often people say that, well, they often, ADUs are often have constraints such as owner occupied, or the owner cannot live in the ADU accessory unit. But we don't regulate single family homes from being rented out, and we don't regulate 2 to 3 family buildings from getting rented out normally, and we don't require we also don't require occupancy or owner occupancy in those instances. So it's a strange, for some reason, people, when we talk about accessory dwelling units in single family, people have a real negative approach to them. Don't regulate who is allowed, and don't require independent utilities, which drives up the cost, and utility connections. And parking, let them park on the street. It's not a big deal. And allow them to be in all the residential areas, and both within an existing and an accessory unit building. So moving to the next one is requiring special permissions for completely normal stuff. conditional use permits and variances and waivers for things that ought to be by right. If you want smaller houses and smaller lots, that needs to be, should be able to do that without having to go through a bunch of going before the zoning board and then the planning board and then back to the zoning board and all kinds of things. The same 4-unit house, as we mentioned, is a house-sized apartment building. If that's the multifamily that your town wants to make, it's easy to build. Often we make the good things complicated and the bad things easy. And the 70 suburban zoning really puts a kink in actually replicating our existing places. So requiring special permits, we talked about these things are often not allowed, especially in the single family zones, or you would require special permits to maybe even just get to 2 units. There are complicated paths to building code compliance. Oftentimes, I think 1 to 2 units are under the IRC, International Residential Code, versus the anything from 3 units and up is under the International Building Code. So it's by building code enforcement folks, it's considered a commercial building, and so they have different requirements, and oftentimes it's sometimes it can get onerous, and it can make things more expensive as we move forward. So make sure that everyone who deals with sprinklers and access and all the rest of that understand that the goal to getting buildings is safe, operational, and paying taxes. So we don't want to, we just want to get to a point where we can get people to live, we can provide safe places for people to live, and give people as many choices as possible. So rather than making the perfect the enemy of the good, and look at being able to look at each building individually, or to being flexible for the building code official to be flexible enough so that it can they can make them available. So adopt the IEBC, International Existing Building Code, which gives you a lot of flexibility with existing buildings, especially when you're renovating. And they could be, you can change a single family home to a 3-family or 2-family, and make sure that you can allow for a simple sprinkler system rather than the residential grade sprinkler system rather than requiring commercial grade sprinkler systems. Counting pillows. So what does that mean? It's oftentimes there are rules about how many unrelated people can live together. That has nothing to do with health and safety and welfare requirements. Manage how, instead of trying to regulate who lives where and how, and what their relationships should be, we should manage where they park their cars, or how many beds in a bedroom, or how many residents per bathroom. All the things that the health code deals with this. But don't get involved in regulating relationships. That would be a problematic ordinance. So read the Unlock Home by Alan During, and don't regulate relationships. So not respecting existing conditions. As I mentioned, I think that much of the codes, the zoning rules that were adopted were adopted in the 70s early 70s, late 60s, early 70s in this area, in this region. And they completely outlawed about 80 to 90% of the existing buildings and the uses. The suburban zoning completely ignores the existing conditions in older neighborhoods where they are already narrow lots and duplexes and backyard cottages and maybe even a corner store. They are considered grandfathered non-conforming uses or lots. And often when one of these is unused for 12 months, then it can't be reused in the same way. So there are tenure requirements, and those tenure requirements sometimes outlaw them if they've gone unoccupied. So we can eliminate those. Be easy things to do. A lot. A building is a building, and if it burns down, even if it burns down, can it be rebuilt in the same way? So hopefully it can be, but that's not guaranteed. So protect and permit existing conditions and allow people to rebuild a mixed use, the same as it always was. I mean, the things that can be they should be replaced exactly, to be able to do it right. Mismatched building scale. Avoid aggregating into big lots, especially in your main streets and in your business districts. Let's see. So, just don't allow them to just avoid having to aggregate into big lots. Just keep them from keep the lots exactly as it is and help them build in that, and help make it legal to build in those smaller parcels. And then complicated design standards. They are often architectural standards, especially when we have bigger buildings, having to do with there are articulations. We require articulations or varying materiality, in order to make them look like the village vernacular or whatever. Plain things are often best, and design guidelines should be, you should try to make them as plain and simple, and don't dictate, specify the result, what you want to see. Don't dictate how it should be achieved. Often we're having this conversation in our village where we have a development proposal, and it's on an industrial parcel, and it's right next to the train station, and the footprint, they want to build on the same, they want to reuse the foundation that was there. It's actually kind of a story and a half, low slung, nondescript warehouse building. Nothing of the vintage of the 19th century, but so they want to use that, and they want to build a mixed use 4-story building, and they keep coming back with, and people are asking them to, the comments have always been about, well, it doesn't fit the village character, and so they're trying their darndest to make it look like a housey building, right? They wanted to look like a residential structure, and in my opinion, they're getting it all wrong. Unfortunately, I can't speak to it because I'm a board of trustee member, and I think that it would be better if they just took the language of a typical 19th century warehouse building that has been renovated and updated to house live work apartments and the like, but they're not getting it that way. So design standards often, can mislead everything. And finally, highways as city streets. What does that mean? I think when we have incremental development, a lot of the buildings that we want to take, the conditions that are necessary to have these types of developments cannot take place, or if the street is fast and is not people centered and doesn't have parking and doesn't have street trees, because then it needs to be a street. It needs to be a street and not a thoroughfare that is all about throughput of automobile volume, because the places like that only result in strip malls and lots of problematic conditions relative to the street. And so we have to be able to working on a street or figuring out a way for the street to become a people place is setting the conditions for all of these things to happen. And this part isn't about zoning, but this one is about it's probably more in the hands of the DPWs, the public works folks, and the village engineer, or the town engineer, and the transportation folks who are who often shape the way these streets are configured. So ways that you can do this is you can definitely look at NACTO and Complete Streets and Vision Zero policies. I'm sure many of you already are aware of this. And Strong Towns course on aligning transportation and pilot traffic calming installations. So let's make what we want legal. So that's pretty much it. And let's, we can talk and have more questions, answer questions.
Thanks, David. Yeah, any sort of initial questions, thoughts? Jake, I know you shared something in the chat. I don't know if maybe you want to touch on it briefly.
Sure. And I apologize for being late. I was on dinner duty tonight, so great presentation. It's always good to see. I saw this a similar presentation by Ivy Van from IDA, and it's always good to see it again. I shared two things in the chat, and one was just a little bit about ADU reform in Act 179 of last session, and it's just that the Vermont statute created new kind of minimum thresholds for the municipal bylaws in terms of what they have to allow, and it includes some of the flexibilities that David, you were talking about in terms of allowing the occupant or owner to be in the larger or smaller dwelling, and a little bit more flexibility with floor area. And the other is a piece that we put together in the Department of Housing and Community Development as an ADU checklist. And we kind of did this just as a scenario to show when you stack up all the layers of review, state and local, how difficult, like you said, David, it is to build an ADU, notwithstanding the limitations that are already in local bylaws. And that includes financing too, just how difficult it can be for a homeowner without equity in Vermont to unlock financing. There's just not a lot of support programs. And so hopefully some of the key policymakers are looking at that list and thinking about what are the opportunities to make that most accessible housing type, like you put it, David, more accessible.
Right. I think in terms of accessory dwelling units, I mean, AARP recently came out with they published a PDF public, basically an online publication. And ADUs are not just the detached cottage, or it can be a converted garage. It can be a basement, a daylighting basement, or it could be attached to the actual main part of the house too. There's so many different variations that it can take place that might actually, as you look at some of those options, some of those might be attainable in terms of financing and all the regulatory framework as well, if some of this is allowed. Go ahead.
Robin?
Sorry, there's a program with Brattleboro Affordable Area Affordable Housing that they do called Apartment in Homes, and it's supposed to allow people who are having trouble staying in their homes get some kind of income from an apartment, and they subsidize some of that funding. And Brattleboro and Bellows Falls has been looking into it. I think they split and match. So it's not a lot of money, but the homeowner has to come up with some portion of it. BAAH, which is a mouthful, also does, and then the town pitches in. So it's really kind of a neat thing to keep people sort of in being able to afford their homes. But when you look at the demand and how slow sometimes this process goes, it seems like there should be maybe a little bit of a way that we can sort of jumpstart that. That was all I was thinking about. Oh, and also parking is always a problem in Vermont in the city centers, because everybody has a car for the most part, and snow removal is the worst. I was just talking to Gretchen about it earlier, how, in snow removal night, it's impossible because it's all that beep, beep, beep,
Right.
beep. It drives you crazy if you live in town. It's outrageous. But anyway, sorry.
Well, one of the, in my village, I should have probably introduced myself a little more thoroughly when we started, but I'm a board of trustee member, and I ended up getting appointed because of just musical chairs that we had with the mayor and the additional members. But I got involved volunteering with the village because of Route 9, which is basically the old Albany Post Road that goes from New York City all the way up to Albany. It goes, we're right on that route, and unfortunately it's managed and is the jurisdiction of the New York State DOT, and their paradigm is very different than when the way we consider the street is actually a main commercial street, and it's three of our schools are right on that street. And so anyway, I've got involved with that, and my latest involvement was called the Parking Task Force, and we were trying to figure out, well, it's more me, because everybody thought that we just needed more parking when we have in the village and in the business area, we have over 600 parking spaces. That's counting all the municipal lots as well as all the on-street parking spaces that are metered. And so what we did was we looked at the Don Shoup's what is it? The high cost of parking reform, or parking, or high cost of free parking. And he boils down his 700-page book to three basic principles. One is price them right. Basically, let the market forces dictate what the spaces should cost. Meaning they should be charged, and they should be charged appropriately depending upon how much demand there is. And then two is make sure that those basically manage them properly to make sure that those funds go to a tangible improvement in the area that the revenue is coming from, mainly the main streets and the places where the meters are. And then 3, and eventually move towards no parking standards, no minimum requirement for parking. Allow the in many communities or many municipalities, well, not many, but a handful of municipalities that are eliminating parking minimums have also put a cap on parking maximums. Basically, they're saying you can't build any more than X number of parking spaces in this area.
Yeah, so a lot of what you're describing, David, definitely see in Bellows Falls. Some of those pieces, the Planning Commission is starting to make some changes. So what they're doing with the parking, they're allowing developers to purchase village parking permits for the spaces. So 1 car per apartment unit, and they can be away from the building at a village parking lot that is town owned and that has 70 spaces. And also the overlay district. So had an area that was being developed in a way that the residents didn't like it all, and they went to Planning Commission and Select Board and had an overlay district right along the river, and wanted to restrict it to recreational type activities and development that was consistent with friendly, destination oriented, and so they created the riverfront overlay district. The thing you were saying about how many people related to each other, I think it might be a Vermont state rule. I mean, I don't know a lot about it, but just working with a development project where the business that was doing the development, they were looked upon unfavorably by the state because in their housing community, they have like 20 or 30 people that are part of the same family that are, a number of different adults and kids, and they all, they turn in paperwork with all 30 of them have the same last name or something, so that they're saying they're all related, but they're only doing that because I guess there's a requirement that many people can't live in a dwelling, but they can if they're related, something like what you were describing.
Yeah.
So anyway, a lot of things rung true there. Some of the stuff a lot of it we have trouble with. Some of it the Planning Commission has already been making some moves to improve. So really good to understand what all the different pitfalls are. Right. And I love that you broke it out to as simple as make the zoning for what you want. Just picture what you want and make the rules get you there.
Yeah, but unfortunately, getting there isn't a simple thing. But I think that there are, because of some of the efforts that have happened for Vermont, the project for code reform that report was done recently, and it's a way to incrementally change your rules so that you can get to what you want, and get to be able to replicate the things that you value so much about your communities, and to be able to build something new that also fits in nicely with that. So.
John, I saw you were unmuted for a bit. Did you have something to share? No?
Guess not.
Nothing to share. Who else?
And by the way, I never read all 700 pages. It's a nice doorstop.
I would jump in, sir, if I can.
Yeah, please.
Just, thinking about parking, and I'm a, state planning policy manager, but also a city councilor in Berry City, and advise communities around the state. And I was talking to a community about a neighborhood development area designation that requires a lower minimum parking threshold. And I was having a conversation with a planning commissioner, as I'm sure many of us have had, especially if we read Donald Shoup, about what problem are you trying to solve by requiring parking spaces that people don't need or don't want. And really, I think for policymakers, you're thinking about, well, really, it's just about haphazard parking. You don't want people parking on the lawns, or you don't want people causing, tearing up, just disorderly parking. And it seems like Vermont communities have a real hard time making a leap to, well, we can manage that in another way through a different ordinance. But why do we make them overproduce the parking space? It's a bit like saying there's a public interest in people being able to call 911, so we're going to make them put a phone jack every 3 feet on the wall. So I don't know. I think this tips, and then with the public works departments, it's especially hard to get past on-street parking, and just the amount of management that it takes in designing streets for the or in buying equipment for the cities we want, not designing our cities for the equipment we want. And I'm curious if anybody has any wisdom on this call about, like, perhaps on-street shared parking solutions that find some form of balance between all these tensions.
Is there a difference, like for instance, in Bellows Falls, a lot of the on-street parking is oriented sort of at an angle versus, parallel parking? Is there a difference as far as like how the parking spot is actually oriented? Or would you not call what's in downtown Bellows Falls street parking? Street parking?
Yeah, those are street parking.
Yeah.
Are they metered, or are they all free?
They're all free.
Well, that's where you have the problem. When something is free, well, is it in downtown? Is it in the commercial district?
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a time limit, supposedly. There used to be a person who went around and marked your tires, but that person was
You couldn't afford
not
that
paid.
person.
That person wasn't paid, so there's no more person. And
Yes.
I'll just mute myself again.
So I think like 30 years ago or something, there were meters, and people hated them, and they pulled them out, and pretty much merchants, residents, everyone loves that there's no parking meters in the downtown. So there is some paying for parking in terms of, like Robin was saying, the downtown ones are all 2-hour limits, but then there's the large lots where you can park overnight and you need to buy a permit to do that. So there's some mix of paying for spots, but not the having parking meters all over and adding that whole level of complexity.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we have in our village here, or in actually what we call the river towns, there's a series of villages along this side of the Hudson River, and probably all over Westchester. When I think in our parking task force, we suggested that they were contemplating, the board of trustee at that time was contemplating extending the hours, because we have a performance hall, music. It's called a music hall, and so we get a huge crowd coming in every during the weekends, and usually 3 to 4 days out of the week. And so they would arrive, many of them would arrive by car, and take up a lot of the parking spaces. And the businesses, even though they, it's an anchor to the neighborhood, to the whole district. And so even though the businesses benefit, mostly the restaurants benefit, from the patrons, out of town patrons, yet they could only get one seating because, well, according to them, they could only get one seating because they would all come and park, and that there would be no turnover for the second seating, so that anybody who was not coming to the music hall could not. I don't know how true that is, because it's always very difficult to get a real sense of what is really happening. So the board of trustees decided that, well, we consider extending the hours of the meters up to 8 or 9 p.m. so that as somebody who comes are more someone who comes to a performance will park their car in a longer term meter lot as opposed to on the street. Yet that there was no differentiation in terms of the pricing of on the street or the parking lot, and so it's about properly managing it and doing it so that it can pay for itself as well. I mean, what I'm suggesting to the village is that the management should not be in the hands of a bunch of volunteers. It should be a paid. It should be like a real business, because the parking lots that we have as a village, which are in the downtown area, are valuable property, but none of them are paying taxes. So we might have meter or permit revenue, but right now they're all gone. So the whole village apparently is, we have a $1 million drop in parking revenue, because a lot of our parking is taken by also commuters, because we're a transportation hub as well into the city. And so but all of these parking lots, they're not really producing anything, and even though if you might be, we say $1 million of revenue a year, but what if they were actually, all of these lots were valuable property that had a bunch of people living over, had real buildings that had real businesses, and what kind of revenue would we see then? So the trade-offs, people don't seem to understand the trade-offs.
Gretchen, does Wilmington have any parking issues? I know you have the lot that's over by the library, and then street parking.
And we also, excuse me, we also have West Main Street, which is like in back of all the buildings, and that holds quite a few. So I always say there is really no issue in parking, but everybody seems to be talking about it. We also use once in a while the old school where the high school was, and we use that for parking. And we put up signs like on busy weekends and things like that. We put up signs directing people to where to park, to make it a little, not so congested in the center of town. But we do have a lot of on-street parking. We have no paid parking, but I don't know. I kind of like the idea of pay for parking, especially for overnight, as Gary was mentioning, because we always have that issue with, we have quite a few apartments in our downtown, and we always have that issue of plowing. So. But good information.
Yeah.
Parking and traffic are ubiquitous issues, controversies in every community. So,
there are also a lot of towns, that have state routes going through them, through their downtown. And I know that has that causes issues when it comes to how do you regulate the street if it's regulated by the state.
Do those towns when they say, well, why can't you change any of this, and they just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, it's owned by the state. Oftentimes, because we do that, we hear this a lot in our village, is that when it comes to pedestrian safety, because traffic is off, drivers are usually moving a little too fast, especially when they get to the main part of the village where people are walking across the street, not at crosswalks and the like. There's a post office and drugstore right across from each other, so there's that's a very well traversed place. There are banks right there and the like, and so so whenever a citizen, somebody who's concerned about it, and say, hey, we need to do something. Can't you guys do anything? Well, no, we can't do anything because it's all managed by the state. Yet we ended up moving a fire hydrant so that we can save one parking space in one location. It just kind of, and we were able to get permission from the state DOT to do that, to do all the work. Yeah. So, I don't know what the bureaucracy is like for the DOT for Vermont, but New York is it's much more. It's very very opaque, and
VTrans is constantly trying to get us to take over, because ours is Route 9 and 100, and they are constantly trying to get us to take it over, so that we do have more control. But we also have a huge bridge that is right in the center of our town, and we just don't want to really be responsible for replacing that. And they keep saying, oh, but you as a municipality would get more funding if you were the one going to replace it. We as the state don't get as much funding. I'm not sure I believe that.
I think it depends on what happens on either side of that bridge and what happens along that route.
So I think some of it also is issues of scale. So Bellows Falls, there's 3 pretty large public parking lots that people will, as Gretchen was saying, there's not a parking problem, but you will hear people talk about it a lot sometimes. They want to have a place for someone to park right in front of their store, but really everywhere in Bellows Falls is within 2 blocks of one of any of these 3 public parking lots. And that density, I like what you said, of keeping the parking concentrated in those lots and not having a lot of little parking lots taking up spaces that there could be revenue generating buildings in. And also we don't run into the problem with the state route so much, because there's an interstate exit a couple of miles to the north of the village and a couple of miles to the south of the village. And there's not really east-west is all separated by rivers and ridges. So most of the state routes run, the traffic runs north-south, and they're on the interstate. So I don't know. I think some of that can be scale related.
Yes, definitely.
I just want to be mindful of our time. It is 7:40. So if anyone else has thoughts, comments, questions, we'll hear them now. But if not, I'm going to go eat some dinner.
And I'm sure we'll see each other again soon. So
John,
we'll let you go. We'll let you go to dinner, Sarah. But I did want to Jake a shout out for posting that ADU 101. That looks to be something that might be quite useful working with lots of towns. So,
Awesome. Great. Well, like I said, this is being recorded. David will send me the PowerPoint.
Sure.
So
Yes.
you can review that too, share it with all your fellow town people, and make some changes maybe. I don't know, just a thought. Well, thank you so much, David.
All
I
right. You're
appreciate
welcome.
it.
Thank you for
Thanks
having
everyone
me.
for joining. Have a great Thursday night.
Good night.
Thank